Okay, I finally found some time to do another video. So I'm doing another video for all of you that like driving and would like to improve. I'm focusing on bad habits that people have, things that people do. They may not realize that they're doing them and they're wrong, but hopefully this video will cover a lot of stuff you may recognize yourself doing some of these things. So hopefully this will help you not to do them anymore. Let me say that the reason I think the standard of driving is so poor on the roads these days is because of the driving instructors that teach people to drive cars. When you learn to fly an aeroplane, the standard has to be very high. You don't often hear about planes crashing into each other in the sky. The minimum standard to get a private pilot's license is 40 hours. And then to go on to get a commercial, it's 250 hours of training, and then for an airline transport pilot license, a lot more than that. So I kind of blame the DVSA for not enforcing a minimum number of hours with driver training. I blame the driving instructors for not taking driver education further. A lot of instructors will just focus on getting the training through the test. It's difficult. People don't want to spend more money than they have to on learning to drive, so I understand that. But I'm doing these videos and I hope that people share them. Even car driving instructors, car driving schools could share them and help the trainees to have a much better understanding of what goes on the road. There's so many things that don't get taught in terms of etiquette. The highway code doesn't really cover etiquette much. For example, when you're the lead vehicle, we love queuing in this country. If we see a queue, we want to go and join it. But in the same way, when we're driving in traffic, there is something called the concept of the lead vehicle, where if you are the lead vehicle, number one, you have a responsibility to drive in such a way that you promote safety and help those behind you. If you see a hazard ahead developing, coming off the gas early, slowing down early so that people behind you don't have to jump on the brakes. Also, if you're the lead vehicle, you have a responsibility to try and keep the vehicle rolling and keep the queue behind you rolling to minimize something called the concertina effect, where basically, for example, you're coming up to a traffic light, the traffic light's red. As the lead vehicle, you've got a responsibility to slow down and try and anticipate the light changing, so when you get to it, you keep rolling, all the traffic behind you keeps rolling, and that minimizes traffic delays. It minimizes the concertina effect, much like a pace car in a race. But unfortunately, that doesn't get taught to drivers, and for some reason, people never seem to figure it out, even when they get more experienced. I think British drivers tend to be quite naive. They don't have their instincts aren't necessarily as sharp as people on the continent, and maybe drivers in other countries where they don't really obey the rules as well. So your instincts have to be a lot sharper. Otherwise, you're at much greater risk of having an accident. The best way to sharpen your instincts is actually to compete in motor racing, whether that be motorcycle racing, track racing, rallying, or go-karting. If you've competed in racing, your instincts do get a lot sharper because you're used to driving in very close proximity, overtaking, undertaking, being cut up, cutting people up, and it just tends to sharpen your instincts. Much like someone who either trains in boxing or martial arts will naturally have better fighting instincts. So the part of the brain that deals with the world around us is called the cognitive part, the cognitive awareness. And that's basically how we see the world around us, interact with the world around us. And the part of the brain that deals with movement is called the psychomotor part. It gives us our psychomotor skills, our hand-eye distance coordination. And racing would improve that a lot. I mean, when you're on a competitive environment, when you're racing, that's really going to sharpen your cognitive awareness and your psychomotor skills. Also, your coordination. If you're having to drive a manual racing car with a crash gearbox, you're having to double the clutch and heel and toe, where you're operating the brake and accelerator and the clutch all at the same time. And that improves your coordination, and it also tends to reduce what we call cross-coupling. And cross-coupling is something that pilots get taught about, that drivers, as far as I'm aware, have never been taught about, which is where when you do one thing, it affects something else. So for example, coordination is when you release the clutch pedal and press the gas pedal at the same time. That's desirable. But cross-coupling is when you, for example, every time you check your mirror, you tug the steering wheel, or when you're pushing and pulling on the steering, if it's a bit heavy, your foot starts to lose sensitivity on the pedals, and you start to either pump the gas or pump the brake, and it affects the steering affects what you're doing with the pedals as well. That's called cross-coupling. You need to learn to isolate your hands and your feet. So when you're operating the steering, it doesn't affect your pedals. And in the same way, isolate your eyes and your hands. So every time you look in the mirror, it doesn't affect what your hands are doing on the steering. By the way, a good tip for someone who's overdriving, overcorrecting. We see this a lot with buses where, because the bus is on air suspension, the trainees are overcorrecting on the steering, trying to correct every bounce in the air suspension. And the way to get around that is just to get the trainees to drive with just their fingertips. And when they've just got their fingertips on the wheel, they can then see how they need to hold the steering and how small the inputs are that they have to make, and how they shouldn't overcorrect with the inputs. And that tends to help them a lot. When you first learn to drive a bus or a large vehicle, you wish the bus was smaller because it's quite overwhelming. You think, my God, this is so big, I wish it was smaller. As you get more experienced, you actually wish the bus was bigger, because when you learn how to handle the vehicle, you realize that size is an advantage. When you're coming into tight situations, you can straddle, you can block off both sides. And when you're turning, a larger vehicle does tend to dominate the road more. So the swept path of the vehicle tends to make other road users keep away. So that's why some of the drivers who drive coaches and double deckers and long single deckers don't like going down to drive little 11-seat minibuses, because they think the vehicle's too small, it doesn't behave like a proper bus, and also they haven't got the advantage of size. So when you learn all these things, you start to develop a state of what we call metacognition. Metacognition is basically like an adult way of thinking. So as you're doing something, you learn how to monitor yourself. So unlike a child which does something, the way of thinking is called phenomenological. It's very childlike. You're doing something and you're not really aware of what you're doing. Metacognition is doing something and being completely aware of what you're doing and being able to correct yourself and monitor yourself at the same time. So that's the ultimate goal, to be able to develop a state of metacognition. When you learn to drive, you probably don't get taught that position is far more important than speed. When you see people tearing around in their cars, they think that driving fast is great, but it's not them that's going fast, it's the car that's going fast. They're just pressing the accelerator. A really good driver will always prioritize position more than speed. And in fact, with the police driving course, we use a system to call MSPSL, mirrors, signal, position, speed, look. Position being the third most important thing in the order. The police actually do it slightly differently. They use a system called IPSCA, information, position, speed, gear, acceleration. So they put position as number 2. But position is far more important than speed. Once you've got your position, then you can think about increasing your speed, but you shouldn't be increasing your speed until you've got the right position. So for example, when you're moving out to overtake, move out first and then increase your speed. You've probably seen something called the racing line. It's what racing drivers use to get around a corner. It basically means straightening the corner as much as possible. Well, I never heard anybody talk about the driving line. The driving line is the sort of line that the police are taught to follow when they're overtaking and responding to a situation to get there quickly. It's a bit more advanced than that, actually. It's also, with a large vehicle, it's also having to think about the sweep and the swing of the front and the rear of the bus, and how you need to move out early to get the vehicle, present the vehicle straight. We always want to present the vehicle straight for any situation, and we always want to be in the middle of any gap. And I've done other videos about the driving line, so you can have a look at those. And the other thing I tend to emphasize a lot is, rather than going on about speed, it's actually trying to get the trainees to hold the right gear. So when you're driving an automatic vehicle, a lot of people will look at the speedometer, but they have no idea what gear they're in, and they've got no appreciation of when the bus is going to change gear or when it's going to change down gear. So what I tell my trainees to do is, as they're driving along, listen to the engine and predict when it's going to change gear. And when it changes gear, if they get more or less the correct speed, to hold that gear. By using the gas pedal to hold the gear, it makes it a lot easier to control the vehicle into tight situations, rather than letting the gearbox change into the next gear, which would then make the vehicle too fast and you wouldn't have as much engine braking. And in the same way, if you ease off the gas early, the gearbox will drop into a low gear, and that will do a lot of the slowing down for you. You won't need to use the brakes as much. So all these things go together to basically enable us to configure the bus to bring it in at the right speed and in the right position. In the same way like a pilot has to configure the aircraft when they're landing, present the aircraft straight for the runway, make sure that the landing gear is down, flaps are set, engine power is set, and the attitude is set correctly. In the same way, we need to configure the bus to bring it in at the right speed, at the right attitude, and make sure it's in the correct gear and our position is correct to the meeting situation or to overtake. So we think about configuring the bus. And the other thing we need to be able to do is to interrogate the road, to be able to look at the road and extract as much information as we can from it. Basically, look for all the clues that experienced drivers look for, things that will tell us what's going to happen next. For example, a green traffic light won't stay green, it will change. So if you can see the traffic light far down the road and you know it's been green for a long time, you can predict that the time that you get there, it probably might well change. And apart from interrogating the road, we need to be able to discriminate. We need to be able to discriminate between real developing hazards and things that we think are going to happen that might not. And we've got to have a broad field of vision. I always tell the trainees to think of the mirrors as part of the windscreen. Don't think that the mirrors are something extra. Just think that you're extending your gaze left and right, and the mirrors form part of the windscreen. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at in terms of bad habits and what people do is when people cut in the yellow box junctions. So a good example of this is you're waiting at a set of traffic lights. There are 2 lanes. The traffic in the outside lane is really heavy, and you're waiting in your bus or your coach here, and you've got a 15-meter coach here, so you need a nice long area in front of you to be clear to get across the yellow box junction. And what happens is every time there's a gap in front of you, because you don't move, because you haven't got enough space now, a car from the other lane nips in and steals your space. Now that's just plain dirty. I would never do that. I hope none of you ever do that. You've got to realise that the reason that this vehicle is holding back here is because he needs a 15-meter gap to get across safely. And if every time a gap develops and you nip across and steal that gap, that driver of that lorry or that coach quite rightly is going to get very angry, and don't be surprised if you get some abuse. So that's the first dirty bad habit. The second thing is similar to that. It's overtaking into hazard zones. So for example, again, we go back to the concept of the lead vehicle. You come up to maybe a zebra crossing. And you see, as the lead vehicle, that there's somebody waiting to cross the road, on this side. Now, rather than rush up there and stop, you realise what's going on, you ease off the gas nice and early to encourage that person to cross before you get there. That way you can keep rolling. And as you're easing off the gas, some idiot on a motorcycle or a scooter or even a car nowadays decides to overtake you. Well, obviously that's stupid. I mean, the zigzag lines mean 3 things. They mean no stopping at all, no parking, and no overtaking. So if some idiot decides to overtake you in a zigzag area, they're actually breaking the law. And so that's overtaking in hazard zones. Another example of overtaking into a hazard zone might be when you're braking into a tight corner and you slow the vehicle down to get around and some idiot overtakes you. Or, for example, when you're going into a meeting situation which is quite tight and you won't get through and you need to slow down or hold back, and again some idiot overtakes you into a hazard area. Very similar to that one, the next bad habit is when people park on zigzag lines. So as I said before, zigzag lines mean no parking, no stopping and no overtaking, and nowadays you get people parking on the zigzag lines. Well, part of the problem is the zigzag lines should be a minimum of 75 feet on either side of the crossing or the traffic light. But now what the council do is they actually shorten the zigzag lines and they put parking bays in so people can park closer to the crossing. So the council themselves are guilty of negligence because they should never be doing that. The idea of having these zigzag lines is to protect the pedestrians, to have a clear zone of vision as you approach the crossing and there's nothing there. And what they do nowadays, which is even worse, is they put trees along the side of the road, and that blocks the driver's vision, so you can't see if there's anybody waiting. And the other thing they even do is actually put parking bays on the pavement. So as you approach the zebra crossing, you've got cars parked on the pavement, blocking your view of the people waiting to cross. So again, it's the council's negligence, but that doesn't excuse people from parking on zigzag lines when they shouldn't. The next thing we talk about is car park etiquette. This is again something that you probably never get taught because learners don't generally get taught how to do car parks. But basically, when you go into a car park, what people should do is reverse into a parking space. So if you've got parking spaces along on either side, the idea is you go up to the parking space and then you find a parking space that you want and you reverse into it. Well, what people tend to do when they go into car parks is drive nose to tail. So when the car in front does find a parking space, they can't reverse because the idiot behind them has gone right up behind them and given them no room to reverse. Well, it's common sense that when you go into a car park, you should leave at least a car's length between you and the vehicle in front to allow that driver to reverse. And then when the driver does try to reverse, the car behind gets anxious and they start tooting their horn because they think the driver in front is going to reverse into them. Well, what do they expect? I mean, they haven't left the guy any room to reverse anyway. So that's obvious to make sure that you leave enough room for the vehicle in front to reverse. You should always reverse into parking spaces. It means that when you want to move out, it's a lot quicker. You can just drive straight out. And the flip side of that is now people who don't know how to tell the vehicle behind that they intend to reverse. So you'll get some people drive up to a car park and they'll see a parking space and they'll just start to steer to the right to position the vehicle to reverse in. Well, the car behind doesn't know where they're going. When they start to steer to the right, he would think that they're going to drive straight into the parking space over there. What you should do is stop, put your hazard lights on, tell the vehicle behind you that you found a parking space and you intend to reverse. And then when you move forwards slowly so the driver can see that you intend to come backwards. All of this is done with your hazard lights on to tell the vehicle behind you to keep away, to give you space to reverse in. But again, this doesn't get taught to learners. And when people do want to reverse into a parking space as they move forwards, the car behind them thinks they're driving forwards, they come up behind them, and then they can't reverse because they haven't followed the correct procedure. So remember, use your hazard lights and use arm signals as well. That's another really bad habit. By omitting arm signals, by omitting hand signals, you're not doing yourself any favours. You should use hand signals when they are appropriate and necessary to warn other traffic about what you're doing. So the next thing is when it comes to reverse parking, it's very similar to what we just talked about. It's basically when you're driving along the road and you see a parking space and you want to reverse into that space and you pull up alongside, and again the car behind you pulls right up behind you because he doesn't know what you're doing. You just stopped without any warning, and now you want to reverse into that space and you can't because you haven't given the driver behind any warning. Again, this goes back to the concept of being the lead vehicle. If you are the lead vehicle, you've got a responsibility to make sure the people behind you know what's happening. So what you should do is slow down when you get to about here, put your hazard lights on to tell the vehicle behind you something's up, or use your left indicator, and then move forward and then move back into the parking space. But you've got to give them a clear indication of what you're doing and that you intend to reverse park. Right. The next bad habit is not indicating off roundabouts. So you come up to a roundabout, and in this country people do tend to forget to indicate. They should If they're turning right, indicate right. If they're turning left, indicate left. If they're going straight, they don't indicate until you're leaving the roundabout. But the really important signal is the left signal, because that allows other traffic to come onto the roundabout. So, for example, if you're here and you're taking that exit, okay, you've got cars waiting here to come on. Now, they don't know where you're going. You could be turning right, you could be going straight. So by giving the left signal, it tells them that you're taking this exit, and then it allows them to come onto the roundabout. It keeps everything moving. So you should always indicate off roundabouts. The other thing is, when you're at roundabouts, always remember it's not just the indicator that tells you where somebody's going, it's their position and their speed. If they're hugging the roundabout, it's likely that they're turning right. If they've transitioned over to the left, it's likely that they're going to take the exit. So look at their position and their speed to tell you where they're going. Okay, the next one is pedestrian etiquette. Now, this is something that we can all be guilty of as drivers, because at some point we're all pedestrians. And that is basically, drivers aren't taught that when they are pedestrians, how they need to behave. So a good example is zebra crossings. The correct way to use a zebra crossing is to come up to the zebra crossing, stand about a metre back from the edge, and present yourself so that the traffic can see that you want to cross. When the traffic stops, that's when you actually start to cross. You don't just walk out in front of another vehicle and just force them to stop. I mean, when we go back to the hazard lines around a zebra crossing, they should be 75 feet. And what the highway code says is, if the vehicle's in that zone, in that hazard area, it's very difficult for the drivers to stop. So the pedestrians should wait until the vehicles on both sides have stopped before they attempt to cross. But unfortunately, we get people here, and maybe people from other countries where they don't have zebra crossings, so they don't know what the etiquette is, and they'll just come on a zebra crossing and walk straight out. So yeah, that's another really bad habit. Going back to etiquette, emergency vehicle etiquette, a lot of people don't know how to respond to emergency vehicles properly. If you're driving along a narrow road and you see a blue light and siren behind you, keep going. Don't stop where the road is narrow, because it's making it very difficult for the emergency vehicle to overtake you. Keep going. In fact, just maintain the speed limit if you can, until the point where the road starts to widen up, and then put your left signal on and pull over. Understand that when you do that, once the emergency vehicle has overtaken you, look for a second emergency vehicle, because sometimes if it's a serious fire or accident, there might be a number of emergency vehicles traveling in convoy. They may not all be right behind each other, they may be slightly separated, but look out for any other emergency vehicles that are coming along, and be prepared to stop again. Once the emergency vehicle has passed you, then get your right indicator on, prepare to move, because if you don't, the cars behind you are actually going to take the opportunity to overtake you. They're going to take advantage of the situation, and you're going to be sitting there like a dead duck, waiting to pull out when you've just pulled in to let the emergency vehicle through. If the emergency vehicle is coming towards you, then obviously think about how you're going to approach it. The correct way, again, is to pull over and allow the oncoming vehicle through. But again, think about the traffic behind you, because sometimes what happens is, when an emergency vehicle overtakes you, a lot of drivers don't realise that because you've stopped, the traffic behind you has stopped as well, and that could create a bottleneck where the oncoming emergency vehicle, although they've passed you, they now can't get through because the traffic behind you stopped. So once the emergency vehicle has passed you, keep going to allow the traffic behind you to move and to create a gap for the emergency vehicle. Again, going back to driving etiquette, in the highway code it mentions that you should leave a 2-second gap between you and the vehicle in front. Well, it used to say 3, and they brought it down to 2, which is completely the wrong way for them to behave. They actually should have increased the minimum gap to 4 seconds, because human reaction time is about 2 seconds. By the time you see something and your brain processes it and you actually take action, it's between 1 and 2 seconds. So 2 seconds for a following gap when you're driving at speed on a dual carriageway motorway is just ridiculous. Ideally, you need a minimum of, you do need a minimum of a 4-second gap. And if you're driving a bus or a lorry and it's raining or snowing, the gap needs to be much larger. There is a correlation between the gap that you need in terms of distance and the performance of the brakes on a lot of cars. Really good cars will stop from 60 miles an hour do a complete rest in about 2.5 seconds. So if you imagine, if you're doing 60 miles an hour, it's going to take 2.5 seconds for the vehicle to stop on a dry road. As I said to you, human reaction time is between 1.5 and 2 seconds. That's why it needs to be a 4-second gap. If you've only got a 2-second gap, you're basically expecting the car to stop in half a second, which is just ridiculous. And they should have corrected that in the highway code. So the next thing is U-turn etiquette, and this is something that a lot of people are guilty of. And basically, if you're parked on the side of the road and you want to do a 3-point turn or a U-turn, the correct thing to do is wait to make sure there's no traffic coming from either direction and then perform the turn. Well, what a lot of people do nowadays, because they haven't been taught properly, is they'll sit on the side of the road with the right indicator on, maybe behind some parked cars. Now, the traffic approaching thinks that they want to pull out and carry on ahead. So somebody stops to let them out. And then what happens is the offending car starts to make the U-turn, but they can't complete it because now we've got traffic coming from the opposite direction. Right? So they can't go forwards. This car can't go anywhere because they're blocking the road. And that's all because they've used the indicator when in fact they shouldn't have. They should have just waited until the road was clear and then performed the turn. That's a really, really bad habit, really dirty thing to do as well. I see that a lot nowadays. Okay, the next one is similar to what we spoke about yellow box junctions. It's when you're in a bus lane and somebody wants to turn left and they just cut in front of you. So if you imagine that's the road, this is the solid white line for the bus lane, and there's a left turn up ahead. This is something bus drivers always have to be aware of. As you're approaching that, you've got a car there, the driver sees the left turn, he indicates, you may not see the indicator because he's alongside you, and all he does is he just increases his speed and he cuts in front of you. And if you don't see this, you may end up having to brake sharply and your passengers may fall over. And of course that driver doesn't know what he's done, he's just going to carry on down the road and you're left with an injured passenger. So this is why you must remember when you're driving in bus lanes, you're actually more exposed to danger. Bus lanes are not safer for you. They're actually a lot more dangerous because of your proximity to the curb, because of your proximity to overhanging tree branches and tree trunks, and because of the fact that the bus lanes are actually quite narrow. They narrow the lanes down to get more lanes. And so because of that, you're close to pedestrians, the mirrors can hit pedestrians, and as I said, you're susceptible to being overtaken and cut up by other vehicles. So do be aware of bus lanes, and if you're a car driver, please observe bus lane etiquette. And similar to that, again, is when car drivers don't think about large heavy vehicles behind them. So when they're driving along and they've got an oil tanker behind them or a bus or a coach, and they see something and they just suddenly floor the brake pedal and stop. Maybe they want to pull into a shop, or they suddenly see a parking space and they've got no consideration for the vehicle behind them. And they just brake abruptly without any consideration. I mean, you should be aware of what's behind you, and if you've got a bus or a petrol tanker or something like that vulnerable, be considerate and don't just brake sharply. Similar to that, another pet hate is when car drivers don't keep away from the swept path of a large vehicle. So if you imagine on a left-hand corner, you might be turning left in your coach or bus, and as you do that, the back end is going to swing out. You're going to get some negative swing from the rear, and you're going to have to maybe run wide to get around that corner. And because of the swept path of the vehicle, because of the negative swing and the front sweep, obviously it poses a danger to you and to other road users. So what you don't need is somebody in a cycle, for example, coming right up behind you and trying to pass you just as you make the turn. Because obviously now, as the back end swings out, you could hit that cycle or motorcycle. And again, what you don't need is, as you're making the turn, somebody in a car maybe to come right up here and stop there, because now they're preventing you from completing the turn. So a little bit of common sense, don't get into the swept path of a large vehicle. especially articulated lorries, because it's very difficult for the drivers to see what's going on behind them in the mirrors when the cab and the trailer go out of alignment when they're turning. It's very difficult to see. The next bad habit, again going back to arm signals, it's when you don't give arm signals. Nowadays people tend to drive like they're in little cages. They don't tend to want to interact with other road users. They don't wave, they don't smile, there's no etiquette. And in the olden days, you'll see people driving around London and giving arm signals all the time, waving to each other. Arm signals are very important to say thank you, but also they can sometimes be a lot more effective than actually signaling, because people are so used to seeing the flashing amber signal lights that they sometimes don't really heed them. But if you put your arm out the window and give arm signals, that attracts people's attention a lot better, because they're not used to seeing it. They wonder what's going on. So arm signals can be very effective. There are some great videos on YouTube by a guy called Rob Wilson. He's actually a former Le Mans sports car winner. He's an excellent racing driver, and he actually coaches a lot of the Formula One drivers. He's coached people like Lewis Hamilton, Kimi Raikkonen, and Sebastian Vettel. And if you watch his videos, he's absolutely brilliant. Another great driving god is Walter Röhrl, the German rally driver. If you watch these videos of Walter Röhrl and Rob Wilson, you'll see how they talk about the driver being sympathetic with the car and almost telling the car what they're going to do next by the way they approach a corner, by the way they brake, by the way they steer. They're almost communicating with the car what they want the car to do next. And a very good driver is a very sympathetic driver, and also makes very, very subtle inputs. We say that you're basically preloading the controls. So, for example, whenever you do anything, you do it smoothly. So as you turn the wheel, you just very gently nudge the steering into the corner, and then you put the lock on and turn more. When you're pressing the brakes, you initially just touch the brake pedal, just brush the brakes, dust the brakes, just to tell the vehicle what you're going to do, and then squeeze harder. And in the same way, when you're pressing the gas pedal, you press very lightly at first just to take up any slack in the drive line, and then press harder. Because if you've never driven a really powerful racing car before, it's not like a road car. These vehicles have got so much power that if you're heavy with the throttle, you'll just spin the rear wheels and spin off the track. So everything that you do needs to be smooth, and you do need to communicate with the car. And for the moment, that's about it.